Betty Wilson checked her old wristwatch for the fifth time in 10 minutes. The silver band had turned green years ago, but it still kept perfect time. Just like everything else in her life, it wasn't pretty, but it worked. She stood in a long line outside the grand building, feeling completely out of place among all the young, confident faces around her. The Hartwell Conservatory looked like something from a movie. Tall marble columns stretched up to the sky, and the heavy wooden doors were carved with musical notes and fancy designs. Betty had driven 3 hours to get here, using vacation days she couldn't really afford to take. Her beat-up Honda Civic looked tiny next to all the expensive cars in the parking lot. At 47, Betty knew she looked older than her age. Working at Peterson's grocery store for the past 15 years had left its mark. Her hands were rough from stocking shelves and handling boxes all day. Her brown hair was starting to show gray streaks that she didn't have money to cover up. A cardigan she wore was her nicest one, but it had a small hole near the elbow that she'd tried to hide with careful positioning. The other people in line were so different from her. They carried expensive instrument cases and wore clothes that probably cost more than Betty made in a week. Most of them looked like they were still in college or maybe just graduated. They talked about their music teachers and summer programs at fancy schools she'd only heard about on TV. "Did you study at Juilliard too?" she heard one young woman ask another. Betty didn't even know how to pronounce that word properly. She clutched her plastic folder tighter. Inside were sheets of music that had been in her family for decades. The pages were yellow and soft from age, with pencil marks and notes written in her grandmother's careful handwriting. Grandma Rose had been the one who taught Betty everything she knew about music. Not in some fancy school or expensive music studio, but in their tiny apartment above Murphy's Bakery on Main Street. The old upright piano had been squeezed into the corner of the living room, taking up so much space that you had to walk sideways to get to the kitchen. Betty remembered being 7 years old, standing on a wooden crate so she could reach the keys properly. Grandma Rose would sit beside her on the wobbly bench, guiding her small fingers to the right positions. "Music isn't about being perfect," she used to say in her soft voice that still carried traces of her Polish accent. "It's about feeling something deep inside and letting it out through your hands." Those lessons had been the best part of Betty's childhood. While other kids were playing video games or watching cartoons, she was learning scales and practicing pieces that most children her age had never heard of. Grandma Rose had been strict but patient, never letting Betty quit even when the music seemed too hard. "Your hands were made for this," Grandma Rose would tell her when Betty got frustrated. "I can see it in the way you touch the keys. You have a gift, little one. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." But life had a way of getting in the way of dreams. When Betty turned 16, her father lost his job at the factory. Money became tight, and there was no room for luxury like music lessons, even free ones from Grandma Rose. Betty got a part-time job at the local diner to help with family expenses. Then Grandma Rose got sick, and Betty spent more time taking care of her than practicing piano. After Grandma Rose passed away when Betty was 21, the old piano seemed too quiet. Betty tried to keep playing, but between work and life's demands, the music slowly faded into the background. She got married young to Danny, a nice guy who worked construction. They had dreams of starting a family and buying a house with a proper piano room, but Danny was killed in a car accident just 2 years after their wedding. At 23, Betty was alone and struggling to pay rent on their small apartment. The insurance money helped for a while, but it didn't last long. She had to move back in with her parents and take a full-time job at Peterson's grocery store. Years passed quickly after that. Betty threw herself into work, earning promotions from cashier to assistant manager. She was good at her job and liked helping customers, but something inside her always felt empty. Every time she walked past a music store or heard classical music playing somewhere, her heart would ache a little. The old piano from Grandma Rose's apartment had been sold years ago when her family needed money for medical bills. Betty had cried for hours that day, feeling like she was losing the last connection to her grandmother and her music, but she never completely gave up. Betty found ways to keep music in her life, even if nobody knew about it. She bought an old keyboard at a garage sale and kept it in her small apartment. Late at night, after long shifts at the store, she would put on headphones and play silently, her fingers moving across the keys while the music played only in her head. She volunteered to play piano at the community center during their senior lunch programs. The old folks there always requested the same songs: Moon River, The Way You Look Tonight, classics that made them smile and remember better times. Betty loved seeing their faces light up when she played. She also played at St. Mary's Church on Sundays when their regular pianist was sick. Father Martinez always thanked her warmly, but Betty could tell he thought of her as just a helpful volunteer, not a real musician. Sometimes, late at night in her apartment, Betty would pull out Grandma Rose's old sheet music and play the challenging pieces she'd learned as a child. Her fingers still remembered every note of Chopin's ballades, Bach's Inventions, and Beethoven's sonatas. The muscle memory was still there, waiting beneath years of grocery store routine. It was during one of those late-night practice sessions that Betty saw the advertisement in the newspaper. Hartwell Conservatory Open Auditions, it said in small print at the bottom of the arts section. All ages welcome. Scholarships available for exceptional talent. Betty had stared at that ad for weeks before finally deciding to call. The woman who answered the phone had been polite but surprised when Betty asked about age requirements. "Well, we don't have an upper age limit," she said slowly, as if she'd never been asked that question before. "But most of our students are between 18 and 25. The audition fee was $200, money Betty didn't really have. She'd been saving for a new refrigerator since hers had been making strange noises for months. But something about that advertisement wouldn't leave her alone. Grandma Rose's voice seemed to whisper in her ear during quiet moments at work. "You have a gift, little one." So Betty took money from her refrigerator fund and mailed in her application. She requested time off work, telling her manager she had a family emergency. She couldn't bring herself to admit what she was really doing. It felt too fragile, too impossible to say out loud. Now, standing in this line full of young, talented musicians, Betty wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. The girl in front of her was talking about a master class she'd taken in Vienna last summer. The boy behind her mentioned his upcoming performance with the youth symphony. Betty felt like a fraud, but then she remembered Grandma Rose's hands guiding hers on those old piano keys and the way music had always made everything else disappear. Maybe she didn't belong here, but she was going to try anyway. For Grandma Rose and for the little girl inside her who had never stopped believing in the magic of music. Betty's name was finally called after what felt like hours of waiting. Her legs had gone stiff from standing, and her palms were sweaty despite the cool air conditioning in the building. She followed a young assistant down a long hallway lined with photos of famous musicians and past graduates. Everyone in those pictures looked so professional, so confident. Betty wondered if her photo would ever hang on these walls, then quickly pushed that thought away as too crazy to even imagine. The audition room was bigger than Betty had expected. High ceilings stretched up into shadows, and tall windows let in streams of afternoon sunlight. In the center of the room sat a beautiful black grand piano that probably cost more than Betty made in several years. The sight of it took her breath away. She'd only seen pianos like this in movies or fancy hotels, but it wasn't the piano that made Betty's stomach drop. It was the three people sitting at a long table facing the piano, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else in the world. The man in the middle was older, maybe in his 60s, with silver hair and glasses that he kept adjusting while looking through a stack of papers. His suit was expensive and perfectly pressed. This had to be Dr. Harrison, the head of the school that Betty had read about online. Next to him sat a woman with short black hair pulled back severely, wearing a dark blazer that made her look like she was attending a funeral. The third judge was a younger man, probably in his 40s, who kept checking his phone and sighing loudly. Dr. Harrison barely glanced up when Betty walked in. He flipped through some papers until he found what he was looking for, then looked at her over his glasses with the kind of expression people get when they smell something unpleasant. "Mrs. Wilson?" he said, reading from her application. His voice was cold and formal, like he was reading a grocery list. It says here that you're 47 years old and currently employed at ... He paused and looked more closely at the paper. Peterson's grocery store? The way he said grocery store made it sound like Betty had admitted to robbing banks for a living. The woman next to him raised one eyebrow and wrote something down in her notebook. Betty couldn't see what she wrote, but she was pretty sure it wasn't anything nice. "Yes, sir," Betty managed to say. Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "I'm the assistant manager there." Dr. Harrison made a small sound that might have been a laugh, but not the good kind. "And it also says here that you have no formal musical education. No degree, no certificates, no documented training of any kind." Betty felt heat rush to her cheeks. "My grandmother taught me when I was young. She was a concert pianist before I—" "See," Dr. Harrison cut her off, not sounding interested in hearing more. "Well, Mrs. Wilson, I have to ask, what exactly made you think you were qualified to audition for admission to one of the most prestigious music conservatories in the country?" The question hit Betty like a slap. She stood there for a moment, feeling smaller with each passing second. Behind the judges, she could see a few students who had gathered in the observation area. They were probably waiting for their own auditions, but now they were all staring at her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely hidden amusement. One of the students, a girl who couldn't have been older than 20, whispered something to her friend and giggled softly. Betty caught the words "community college" and "cute" in a tone that made it clear the girl wasn't being kind. The younger male judge looked at his watch again and tapped his pen impatiently on the table. "Dr. Harrison, we're already running behind schedule," he said in a voice that suggested Betty was wasting everyone's time. The woman judge leaned over and whispered something to Dr. Harrison. Betty couldn't hear what she said, but she saw Dr. Harrison nod and make another note on her application. Whatever was written there, Betty was sure it wasn't going to help her chances. "Well," Dr. Harrison said finally, "I suppose since you've come all this way and paid the audition fee, we should at least let you play something." He said it the way someone might agree to watch their neighbor's boring home videos, like he was doing Betty a huge favor that she didn't deserve. Betty nodded and walked toward the piano on legs that felt like they might give out at any moment. Behind her, she heard more whispered conversations from the student observers. Someone said something about affirmative action for age, and several people laughed quietly as she approached the beautiful piano. Betty tried to block out everything else in the room. She set her plastic folder of sheet music on the piano and opened it carefully. The pages inside looked even more yellowed and fragile under the bright lights of the audition room. Next to all the expensive leather portfolios and perfectly organized binders the other students carried, her grandmother's old music looked like something that belonged in a museum, not a serious audition. Dr. Harrison cleared his throat loudly. "What will you be playing for us today, Mrs. Wilson?" he asked in a tone that suggested whatever she chose would probably be disappointing. Betty's hands were shaking slightly as she smoothed out the sheet music. "Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor," she said quietly. This announcement caused a stir in the room. The woman judge looked up sharply from her notes. Dr. Harrison's eyebrows shot up so high they almost disappeared into his hairline. Even the younger judge stopped looking at his phone for a moment. "That's quite an ambitious choice," Dr. Harrison said slowly. "Are you sure you wouldn't prefer something a bit more manageable? Perhaps a simple Mozart sonata or a Bach invention?" "The way," he said, it made Betty feel like a child who had announced she wanted to perform brain surgery. Several of the students in the observation area exchanged glances. One of them shook his head slightly, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing, but Betty had chosen this piece for a reason. It was the last thing Grandma Rose had taught her before she got too sick to give lessons anymore. They had worked on it together for months, with Grandma Rose explaining not just the notes but the story behind the music, the emotions Chopin was trying to express. "I'm sure," Betty said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. Dr. Harrison shrugged as if to say it was Betty's funeral. Very well then, whenever you're ready. Betty sat down on the piano bench and immediately noticed how different it felt from the old bench at home or the wobbly one at the community center. This bench was perfectly balanced and adjusted to exactly the right height. The piano keys were smooth and responsive under her fingers as she tested them briefly, but before she could begin playing, she heard more whispered comments from behind her. Someone said something about train wreck and secondhand embarrassment. Another voice mentioned something about the conservatory's community outreach program, in a tone that made it clear they thought Betty was part of some charity effort rather than a serious audition. Candid, Dr. Harrison was already reaching for his pen, probably to write down his impressions before Betty even played a single note. The woman judge had her arms crossed and was looking at Betty with the expression of someone watching a car accident happen in slow motion. The younger judge glanced at his watch again and muttered something under his breath about wasting time with these people. Betty closed her eyes for a moment and tried to remember Grandma Rose's voice. "Don't play for them," she had always said during difficult pieces. "Play for the music itself. Play for the story you want to tell. The music will speak for you if you let it." Taking a deep breath, Betty placed her hands on the keys and prepared to prove that sometimes the most unlikely people can surprise everyone, including themselves. Betty's fingers hovered over the keys for just a moment. In that silence, she could hear everything: the scratch of Dr. Harrison's pen on paper, someone shifting in their chair, a muffled laugh from one of the students watching from behind. The glass. The room felt heavy with expectation, but not the good kind. It was the kind of expectation people have when they're waiting to see someone fail. Then Betty pressed the first key. The opening note of Chopin's Ballade hung in the air, like a question waiting to be answered. It was soft, almost hesitant, just like Chopin had written it. But there was something in the way Betty played that single note that made it different from what anyone in that room was expecting. The note seemed to grow and breathe, carrying with it all the years of longing Betty had kept locked inside. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, a memory, a promise that something beautiful was about to happen. Dr. Harrison's pen stopped moving. He had been getting ready to write his comments, probably something about lacks proper training or technical deficiencies obvious from the start. But that first note made him pause and actually listen instead of just waiting for Betty to finish so he could move on to the next audition. Betty's left hand joined her right, and the melody began to unfold like a story being told for the first time. Her fingers moved across the keys with a grace that seemed impossible for someone who spent her days lifting boxes and scanning groceries. Each note was perfectly placed, not just in time but in feeling. The students behind the glass stopped their whispered conversations. The girl who had been making jokes about Betty just moments before found herself leaning forward, trying to see better. The boy who had shaken his head in disbelief when Betty announced her piece choice was now completely still, his mouth slightly open. As the music continued, something magical began to happen in that room. The melody that started so quietly began to grow stronger, more confident. Betty's hands moved with increasing certainty, as if they were remembering not just the notes, but the joy of making music without fear or judgment. Dr. Harrison found himself setting his pen down completely. The woman judge, who had been sitting with her arms crossed in clear disapproval, slowly relaxed her posture. Even the younger judge stopped looking at his phone and turned his full attention to the piano. Betty played the first section with a tenderness that spoke of all the quiet moments she had spent with her grandmother, learning not just how to press the right keys but how to make music that meant something. Every phrase was shaped with care. Every dynamic change felt natural and necessary, but it was when Betty reached the more challenging sections that everyone in the room truly understood. They were witnessing something extraordinary. Her right hand began the rapid flowing passages that make this piece so difficult. Notes cascaded from the piano like water flowing over rocks, each one crystal clear despite the incredible speed. Betty's fingers seemed to dance across the keys, never hesitating, never fumbling, moving with the kind of precision that takes years of practice to develop. The students watching were no longer trying to hide their amazement. One of them, a young man who had been at the conservatory for 3 years, whispered to his friend, "I can barely play this piece and I've been working on it all semester." But technical skill was only part of what made Betty's performance so stunning. It was the emotion behind every note that truly captured everyone's attention. When the music turned dark and stormy, Betty's playing reflected that intensity without ever becoming harsh or uncontrolled. When it soared into the higher registers, her touch became light and singing, making the piano sound almost like a human voice. Dr. Harrison found himself transported back to his own student days. When he first heard this piece performed by a master pianist in a concert hall in Vienna, he remembered how the music had moved him then, how it had reminded him why he had fallen in love with classical music in the first place. He hadn't felt that same stirring in years, but hearing Betty play brought it all flooding back. The woman judge, whose name was Professor Chun, had heard hundreds of students attempt this piece over her 20-year career at the conservatory. Most of them could play the notes correctly, and some even had good technique. But very few understood what the music was really about. Betty played as if she had lived through every emotion Chopin had written into the score. As Betty moved into the middle section of the piece, where the melody becomes more lyrical and introspective, tears began to form in her eyes. But they weren't tears of nervousness or embarrassment. They were tears of pure joy, the joy of finally being able to share the gift her grandmother had given her with people who could truly appreciate it. The music seemed to fill every corner of the large room. Even the traffic noise from outside seemed to fade away. The only sound was Betty's piano, telling a story of love and loss, of dreams deferred but never forgotten, of beauty that can emerge from the most unexpected places. When Betty reached the climactic passages near the end of the piece, her whole body became involved in the music. Her shoulders moved with the phrases, her face reflected every emotion the music contained. She played with a passion that was both controlled and completely free, technical mastery serving a deeper musical truth. The younger judge, Professor Williams, realized his hands were clenched in his lap. He had been so caught up in the performance that his body had tensed with the drama of the music. He had heard world-class pianists perform this piece in concert halls around the globe, but he had never heard it played with such raw, honest emotion. As the piece neared its end, the room seemed to hold its breath. Betty's hands moved through the final challenging passages with complete confidence, bringing the music to its powerful conclusion. The last notes rang out in the acoustically perfect room, seeming to hang in the air long after Betty's hands had lifted from the keys. And then there was silence. It wasn't the uncomfortable silence that had filled the room when Betty first walked. This was the kind of silence that follows something truly beautiful, when people need a moment to process what they've just experienced. It was the silence of awe. Betty sat at the piano bench, her hands still poised above the keys, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. She had poured everything she had into that performance, every lesson with Grandma Rose, every lonely night practicing on her silent keyboard, every dream she had carried in her heart for all these years. She had played not just for the judges or the watching students, but for her grandmother's memory, for the little girl who had stood on a wooden crate to reach the piano keys, and for every person who had ever been told they weren't good enough to chase their dreams. In the observation area, several students were wiping their own eyes. The girl who had laughed at Betty earlier looked ashamed of herself. The boy who had shaken his head in disbelief now looked stunned, as if he couldn't quite believe what he had just heard. Dr. Harrison stared at Betty with an expression of complete shock. In 30 years of conducting auditions, he had never been so wrong about someone. This woman, whom he had dismissed as a well-meaning amateur just minutes before, had just delivered one of the most moving performances he had ever heard in this room. Professor June was the first to break the silence, but all she could manage was a whispered, "My God." Betty slowly turned around to face the judges, not sure what to expect. The looks on their faces told her everything she needed to know. For the first time in her life, people were seeing her not as just a grocery store clerk or helpful volunteer, but as what she had always been deep inside, a true musician. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Betty sat at the piano, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. She had given everything she had to that performance, and now she didn't know what to do. With herself, should she stand up? Should she say something? Should she just quietly gather her music and leave? Dr. Harrison was the first to move. He slowly set down his papers and removed his glasses, cleaning them with shaking hands. When he put them back on, he looked at Betty as if he was seeing her for the very first time. Where ... double quotes, he started, then stopped. His voice came out as barely a whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again. Where did you learn to play like that? The question hung in the air. Betty could see that Dr. Harrison was struggling to understand what he had just heard. This was a man who had spent his entire career around music, who had heard thousands of students play, who thought he could predict someone's abilities just by looking at their application. And Betty had just shattered every assumption he had ever made. My grandmother, Betty said softly, her voice still thick with emotion from the performance. She taught me everything. Professor Chun leaned forward in her chair. Your grandmother was a piano teacher? Not exactly, Betty replied, wiping the tears from her cheeks. She was a concert pianist, back in Poland before the war. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Even the students in the observation area had moved closer to the glass, straining to hear every word of this conversation. Dr. Harrison's expression changed completely. What was her name? Rose Kowalski, Betty said. Though I think her stage name was different. Everything changed when she came to America. Professor Chung gasped and put her hand to her mouth. Rose Kowalski? The Rose Kowalski who performed with the Warsaw Philharmonic in the 1940s? Betty nodded, surprised that anyone would recognize the name. Yes, that's her. She used to tell me stories about performing in those big concert halls, but I thought maybe she was just making it sound more glamorous than it really was. Dr. Harrison and Professor Chen exchanged looks of amazement. Professor Williams, the younger judge, looked confused. I'm sorry, but who was Rose Kowalski? He asked. Professor Chen turned to him with excitement in her voice. She was one of the most promising young pianists in Europe before World War II. I wrote my doctoral thesis partly on her performances. She disappeared during the war, and most people assumed she had been killed. No one knew what happened to her. Betty felt a strange mix of pride and sadness wash over her. She escaped to America in 1943, met my grandfather here, and started a new life, but she never stopped playing, never stopped loving music. She just couldn't perform anymore because of everything that happened. And she taught you, Dr. Harrison said, still sounding like he couldn't quite believe it. Every day after school, Betty explained, in our tiny apartment above Murphy's Bakery, we had this old upright piano that was probably worth about $50, but to her it might as well have been a Steinway grand. She made me practice scales until my fingers hurt, but she also taught me that music wasn't just about playing the right notes. Betty paused, remembering those precious hours with her grandmother. She used to say that every piece of music tells a story, and if you're not telling that story when you play, then you're just making noise. She would sit next to me and explain what Chopin was feeling when he wrote each phrase. What made him choose those particular harmonies? The judges were hanging on every word. Several of the students had given up any pretense of not listening and were openly staring through the glass. She sounds like an incredible teacher, Professor Chun said gently. But this level of skill, you must have continued studying somewhere else after childhood. Betty shook her head. No, there was no money for lessons after Dad lost his job. And then Grandma Rose got sick, and after she died. Betty's voice trailed off for a moment. I guess I just tried to keep what she taught me alive in whatever way I could. Dr. Harrison looked down at Betty's application again, seeing it with completely new eyes. You've been working at a grocery store for 15 years? Yes, sir. Started as a cashier right after high school, worked my way up to assistant manager. It's honest work, and it pays the bills. But you kept playing? Professor Williams asked. Betty smiled sadly. Not as much as I should have. I bought an old keyboard at a garage sale and practiced at home sometimes. I play at the community center for the senior lunch program, and sometimes at church when their regular pianist is sick. But nothing serious, nothing like this. She gestured around the grand audition room. I saw the advertisement in the newspaper about these auditions, and something inside me just couldn't let it go. I kept thinking about what Grandma Rose would say if she knew I had a chance to play real music again and I didn't take it. Professor Chun was writing furiously in her notebook, but not the kind of dismissive notes she had been making earlier. These were excited scribbles, the kind of notes someone makes when they're trying to capture something important before they forget it. "Mrs. Wilson," Dr. Harrison said, and his tone was completely different now. Gone was the condescending formality. From before, now he sounded respectful, almost reverent. "I have to tell you something. In 30 years of conducting auditions for this conservatory, I have never heard a performance like that." Betty felt her heart skip a beat. "Thank you, sir." "No. You don't understand," Dr. Harrison continued. "I've heard students who have studied at the best schools in the world, students who have been playing since they could walk, students whose parents spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on their musical education. And none of them have ever moved me the way you just did." Professor Chun nodded vigorously. "The technical skill is remarkable, but it's the musicality that's truly extraordinary. You play like someone who has lived through every emotion in that piece." "I guess I have," Betty said quietly. "Life has a way of teaching you about joy and sadness, hope and disappointment. Grandma Rose always said that music without life experience is just exercise." Dr. Harrison stood up from his chair and walked over to where Betty was sitting. "Mrs. Wilson, I owe you an apology. When I saw your application, I made assumptions about you that were completely wrong. I judged you based on your background, your age, your lack of formal credentials. That was unprofessional and unfair." Betty looked up at him, surprised by his honesty. "It's okay, sir. I know I don't look like your typical conservatory student." "That's exactly the problem," Dr. Harrison sighed. "We've become so focused on pedigree and credentials that we've forgotten what really matters, the music itself. Your grandmother understood something that many formally trained musicians never learn. She understood that technique serves music, not the other way around." Professor Williams, who had been quiet during most of this exchange, finally spoke up. "Mrs. Wilson, what are your plans? What do you hope to accomplish here?" Betty had been so focused on just making it through the audition that she hadn't really thought beyond this moment. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "I know I'm older than everyone else here. I know I can't afford to quit my job and become a full-time student. I guess I just wanted to see if I was good enough, if all those years of practice meant anything." Dr. Harrison and Professor Chun exchanged another look, this one filled with a different kind of excitement. "Mrs. Wilson," Dr. Harrison said slowly, "what would you say if I told you that you're not just good enough, but that you might be exactly what this institution needs?" Betty stared at him, not understanding what he meant. In the observation area, the students were practically pressed against the glass, trying to hear every word of this unprecedented conversation. "I don't understand," Betty said. Professor Chun smiled for the first time since Betty had entered the room. "Mrs. Wilson, we'd like to discuss some possibilities with you." "Some very exciting possibilities?" Betty stared at the three judges, trying to process what Professor Chun had just said about exciting possibilities. Her mind was still reeling from everything that had happened in the last hour. She had come here expecting to be politely rejected, maybe told she had some natural talent but needed years of proper training. She never imagined anything like this. "I'm sorry," Betty said, shaking her head slightly. "I think I'm still in shock from all of this." "What kind of possibilities?" Dr. Harrison pulled his chair closer to the piano. "Mrs. Wilson, the truth is, you've just given us something we've been missing at this conservatory for years. We've been so focused on technical perfection that we've forgotten about the soul of music. Your performance reminded us why we all fell in love with classical music in the first place." Professor Chun nodded enthusiastically. "We'd like to offer you full Admission to the conservatory with a complete scholarship covering tuition, books, and even a living stipend. Betty's mouth fell open. But I can't. I have to work. I have bills to pay, and I can't just abandon my responsibilities, Professor Williams smiled. We understand that completely. That's why we're thinking about creating something new, a program specifically designed for students like you. Adults who have real-world experience and responsibilities but also have extraordinary talent. You'd be our first student in what we're calling the Life Experience Program, Dr. Harrison explained. You could continue working part-time while taking classes in the evenings and weekends. We'd work around your schedule. Betty felt tears forming in her eyes again. You'd really do that? For me? Mrs. Wilson, Professor Chun said gently, you need to understand something. What you did in here today doesn't happen very often. Maybe once in a decade we hear someone who truly touches our souls. You have a gift that can't be taught in any classroom. It comes from living life and understanding what music really means. The students behind the glass were still watching with fascination. Word had spread through the building about the grocery store worker who had stunned everyone with her playing, and more people had gathered to see what was happening. Dr. Harrison looked at his colleagues, then back at Betty. There's something else. We have connections throughout the music world, concert halls, recording studios, artist management companies. With your permission, we'd like to arrange for some people to hear you play. Betty's head was spinning. I don't understand. You mean like a real concert? Why not? Professor Chun asked. Your story is remarkable, and your playing is even more so. There are people who would love to hear about a woman who kept her grandmother's musical legacy alive while working in a grocery store for 15 years, then walked into an audition and played like that. Professor Williams pulled out his phone. Actually, there's someone here today I'd like you to meet. David Chun, no relation to Professor Chun, is one of the most respected talent managers in the classical music world. He was here observing auditions for some of his younger clients. Betty watched in amazement as Professor Williams stepped outside to make a phone call. Through the glass, she could see him having an animated conversation with a man in an expensive suit who had been sitting in the back row of the observation area. Mrs. Wilson, Dr. Harrison said, I want you to know that even if you decide not to pursue formal studies with us, today has changed how I think about music education. Your grandmother sounds like she understood something that many of us have forgotten, that music is about connecting with people's hearts, not just impressing them with technical skill. Betty thought about Grandma Rose, wishing she could be here to see this moment. She always said that the most important thing wasn't playing perfectly, but playing honestly. She used to tell me that if I played with my whole heart, people would feel it even if I made a few mistakes. She was absolutely right, Professor Chun said. And you played with your whole heart today. I could feel every emotion you put into that music. Professor Williams returned with the man in the expensive suit. Mrs. Wilson, I'd like you to meet David Chun. He manages some of the most successful classical musicians in the world. David Chun stepped forward and shook Betty's hand warmly. Mrs. Wilson, I have to tell you, I've been coming to auditions at conservatories for 20 years, and I've never heard anything quite like what you just played. Professor Williams filled me in on your background, and I think your story could inspire millions of people. Betty felt overwhelmed. I'm just a regular person who learned to play piano from my grandmother. That's exactly what makes you special, David said. The classical music world sometimes feels disconnected from ordinary people's lives. You could help bridge that gap. You could show people that beautiful music doesn't just belong in fancy concert halls. It belongs wherever there are people who need to hear it. Dr. Harrison stood up and walked to the window overlooking the campus. Mrs. Wilson, I've been thinking about something while we've been talking. Would you be interested in doing a special performance here at the conservatory? Nothing too formal. Maybe just a small concert for our students and faculty? Betty's eyes widened. You want me to give a concert? Here? Think about it, Professor Chun said excitedly. Our students spend so much time focused on technique and competition. They need to be reminded that music is about communication and emotion. You could teach them something they can't learn from any textbook, David Chun nodded. And if that goes well, we could talk about other opportunities. There are music festivals that would love to feature someone with your story. Community concerts, educational programs, maybe even some recording projects. Betty sat quietly for a moment, trying to absorb everything that was happening. Just this morning, she had been worried about whether she'd embarrass herself in this audition. Now these people were talking about concerts and recording contracts, and changing her entire life. "I need to ask you something," Betty said finally. "Why me? Why now? There must be hundreds of people with more training, more experience, more talent." Dr. Harrison turned back from the window. "Mrs. Wilson, talent like yours is incredibly rare. But what's even rarer is the combination of that talent with genuine life experience and emotional depth. Most of our students are brilliant, but they're also very young. They haven't lived long enough to understand what some of these pieces are really about. You've experienced loss, struggle, hope deferred, dreams that seemed impossible," Professor Chun added. "When you play music about those emotions, you're not just playing notes, you're sharing your life." David Chun pulled out a business card. "Mrs. Wilson, I'd like to propose something. Give me permission to make a few phone calls. Let me talk to some people about arranging a small showcase concert, maybe in a few months. Nothing huge or scary, just a chance for some important people in the music world to hear you play." Betty took the card with trembling hands. "And what about the conservatory?" "The scholarship offer stands indefinitely," Dr. Harrison said. "Take all the time you need to decide. But I hope you'll at least consider it. We could learn as much from you as you could learn from us." As Betty gathered her sheet music and prepared to leave, she noticed that a small crowd had gathered outside the audition room. Students, faculty members, and staff had all come to see the woman who had created such a stir. As she walked past them, she heard whispered conversations about her performance. "I heard she made Professor Chun cry," one student said to another. "My friend was in there watching, and she said it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever heard," said someone else. Betty made it to her car before the full impact of what had just happened hit her. She sat in the driver's seat of her old Honda Civic, surrounded by all the expensive cars in the parking lot, and started to cry. But these weren't tears of sadness or disappointment. They were tears of joy, gratitude, and overwhelming possibility. She thought about calling in sick to work tomorrow so she could process everything that had happened. Then she thought about Grandma Rose, about how proud she would be to know that all those hours of practice in their tiny apartment had led to this moment. Betty started her car and began the 3-hour drive home. Tomorrow she would go back to Peterson's grocery store and stock shelves and help customers just like she always did. But everything would be different now, because she finally knew that her dreams weren't too big or too late. As she drove, Betty began to plan what she would play at her first concert. She had a feeling that Grandma Rose would have some suggestions.